Flooded with controversy since its very inception, it was destined to crash and burn. However, what happened before said burning would lead to it being a haunting blemish on the face of Pennsylvania and America as a whole. What was meant to be a way to separate the less fortunate and troubled from the general public would be the house to a multitude of unspeakable acts, unsanitary conditions, and despicable neglect that would be subjugated to innocent people who just needed another chance at life. Being invisible to the public for over 60 years before being exposed in 1968, this is the story of Pennhurst State School. Authorized for construction in 1903, its original name was Eastern Pennsylvania Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. It was a state-funded establishment made in order to either ease, treat, or rehabilitate those who were considered to be physically or mentally handicapped. When it was finally completed in 1908, it was pretty prestigious for its time and had a span of 20 buildings on its property. However, its greatness and professionalism was only surface level, as its intentions and execution would unfortunately persist for years to come. It is clear to see looking back at the creation that it was made rather to remove the feeble-minded from the streets, rather than to actually help and rehabilitate them. Due to the tolerance of people at the time, the mentally and physically disabled were seen as a blemish on the good image of the public and were deemed unfit for citizenship. These people would a lot of the time be taken against their will by the government as a way to keep them off the streets and more despicably from reproducing. You see, at the time, the classification for what was considered to be unable to function was extremely vast. They were taken schizophrenics, epileptics, the mentally impaired, mutes, the deaf, the blind, amputees, paraplegics, people with anger issues, even people with imperfect speech. The asylum would have problems from the start because of this. Overcrowding was an immediate issue at the start, and the asylum had a lack of funds to compensate. It wouldn't help that over time, the list of patients taken in would go on to include immigrants, the impoverished, orphans, and bizarrely, even criminals. The inner workings of the asylum would be unknown to the general public for over 60 years, until the year 1968 with the release of the documentary Suffer the Little Children. Produced by NBC Philadelphia, Suffer the Little Children unveiled the harsh reality of the horrific events and specifics about Pennhurst Asylum. Grown people tied to cribs, malnourished and unsupervised patients rolling in their own filth, and a drastically low staff were the first things seen by the crew. Unfortunately, the living conditions were even worse. Rusted utensils and equipment throughout. The walls were decrepit and falling apart, feces and urine caking the floor, and there were rats and flies infesting the living spaces. The average amount of money spent on a zoo's animals at a time was about $7.15 a day, while Pennhurst could only afford about $5.90 on each of their patients. However, 80% of that would be used to pay off the administrative costs at the institution. During the average full day, there would be only 9 MDs, 2 psychiatrists, and 11 teachers who were all uncertified in teaching special educations working at the institution, whose job it was to treat over 2,800 patients. However, even if they were professionals, their tactics and treatment would be anything but. Harsh discipline was a common occurrence at Pennhurst. Whether it be physical assault to keep patients in line, or even an account where the head medical physician injected a patient with the most painful injection he could find, just to prove a point and establish his control over him. That head physician's name was Jesse Fear. After interviewing Fear, he would admit to also punishing patients who acted out of line by what he described as downgrading them, which would be putting them into cottages which were packed to the brim with patients with severe mental disabilities. This was done as Dr. Fear proclaimed to offend their dignity and make them feel as if they were on the same spectrum of those who are way worse than them on an intellectual scale. The degrading of patients wouldn't end there. All patients were called children, despite there being a vast percentage of adults in the institution, with the average age being around 36 at the time. This naming system, along with the downgrading, influenced regression within the asylum's patients, with only physical abnormalities, and especially those who were just slightly on the spectrum. There was a segment in the documentary with a child patient who is known only as John. Despite his age and having an IQ of only 69, he was able to give a competent interview of his feelings and experience while living at Pennhurst.
Why are you here in Q2, John?
I did something I wasn't supposed to be doing.
So they punished you and put you here?
Yes.
Do they do this all the time to you, John?
Yes.
Johnny used to talk a lot more before he came to Q2, but ever since he's been here, he's talking less all the time.
The room that John was living in was flooded with patients who were on a way higher spectrum than him, and could be heard howling and communicating throughout John's interview. John was not benefiting from his treatment at Pennhurst. His communication and education skills were being stunted, and Dr. Fear was hesitant to give his response on the matter. The documentary would be so depressing that the writer and host Bill Baldini couldn't even finish the series due to exhaustion and sheer mental anguish due to the subject matter. While they do talk about some 200 patients making progress at Pennhurst, they still have 2,600 other patients, either aimlessly wandering the halls or shackled to their beds devoid of movement. The sad fact is that Pennhurst was full of patients stuck there, yearning for a better life, some wanting to leave, and some wanting to work jobs and do something with their life. But they couldn't do anything due to their lack of education and lack of reform. They couldn't enhance any further skills due to lack of government funding. They were practically abandoned by their family with no home to go back to. They were essentially trapped at Pennhurst. There are many factors into why Pennhurst failed, but one of them is lack of government interest in actually helping those that society deemed unfit for citizenship. They failed to provide the appropriate staff, equipment, medicine, and pretty much anything that would actually make the asylum anything different to what it was. A monument to society's neglect of those less fortunate, the people who deemed the disabled as less than people and used Pennhurst as a way to erase them from the streets. A way for parents to neglect those who needed them most. A way for America to look perfect and not inferior to others. Unfortunately, the government would hardly ever step in to fix the financial, ethical, and architectural struggle that was plaguing Pennhurst, and its problems would continue to persist until its closure almost 20 years later as a result of the Halderman v. Pennhurst case in 1984, which began after a multitude of assault cases were finally being made against the staff. Pennhurst would also be deemed as unsanitary, inhumane, and dangerous, which would lead to its closure in 1987. Although it has been closed down for over 35 years, the physical and mental scars still linger on the patients living today. Though it may be true that the building was understaffed and underfunded, the absolute treatment of the patients can never be excused. There were hundreds of children just like John who just needed someone to teach, raise, and love them. But instead, they were left to fend for themselves, in cramped and disgusting rooms filled with mostly people who were barely even able to talk. They never had a chance to improve because the staff cared more about establishing discipline rather than deciding what was best. People like Jesse Fear should feel very ashamed for what they've done to these people. That goes to the government and the higher-ups who neglected to realize the actual effect they were having. Every person born deserves a fair chance at life, but society thought otherwise and treated Pennhurst as a dumping ground for those they deemed unworthy for their society. Thankfully, America's treatment and tolerance of the mentally and physically disabled is nowhere near as bad as to what it once was. However, the steps that America took to get to that point were certainly not seamless. I'm gonna leave you off with an interview with a 20-year-old patient simply named Joe. This has been Cthulhu Creek, and thank you for watching.
Joe, how long have you been in Pennhurst? Do you know how long you've been here, Joe? That you remember?
I was 19 when I first came up.
How old are you now, Joe?
20.
You want to go home?
Yeah, I like to.
Who's going to take you home?
Nobody.
Why, Joe?
They don't want me to.
You mean the people don't want you to go home with them?
Nope.
You mean your mother and father?
My mother's in Lawrence,in Virginia Hospital. I can't go down there and see her.
Uh-huh. How about your daddy?
No.
He doesn't want you. Who loves you the most, Joe?
My mother.
Yeah? Who else?
My father.
Who cares about you?